Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the people and the clergy of Church of the Holy Communion, I welcome you to the latest installment of our speaker series, which has been made possible through generous estate gifts from the Kesmar and Lancaster families. Holy Communion is a community of teaching and learning, and I got ahead of the bell. And we run on a tight clock here. We celebrate questions and we work together as we seek the truth of their answers. Our speaker series has hosted such notable guests as Anne Lamott, Phyllis Tickle, Ross Douthit, and Elaine Pagels. Our guest this evening continues this tradition of pursuing an intellectually rigorous faith. Walter Brueggemann is the William Marcellus McPheeters Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. He is inarguably the most prominent Christian theologian of the Old Testament, still writing and speaking today, and a major voice on theological and social justice matters. In a recent interview with our Minister of Communications, when asked about the connection between scriptural interpretation and his passion for social justice, Dr. Brueggemann responded, "I think we have such a long habit of reading the Bible in poor ways. If we learn to read the Bible well, the connection to social justice is inescapable." It is a great pleasure for me to welcome to this sanctuary a scholar of such prominence and a Christian of such devotion. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Walter Brueggemann.
Well, I am delighted to get to be with you tonight, and thank you for your hospitality. I am grateful to Ben Badgett and Eileen Farmer for having made this possible, and I'm glad to have a chance to think with you for a little bit about our faith. I have been working on subjects of economics in the Bible, so that's what I'm going to talk about. I think everyone understands that we are in an economic crisis in our society, and the question that I've been ruminating about is how the church understands the Bible in relationship to that. And I think for many of us it means learning to read the Bible differently toward public questions. So I have two theses tonight. It's not very complicated. The first thesis is that the Bible originated in an economy of extraction and continues to be read in an economy of extraction. By extraction, I mean the process to legally extract wealth from vulnerable people and transfer it to powerful people. My second thesis is that the Bible resists an economy of extraction and keeps proposing an alternative neighborly economy. So in order to share with you my sense about the context within which we read the Bible in an economy of extraction, I have listed 5 titles on this program leaflet that you have, and I want to comment on those briefly in case any of you are up to reading. They're not difficult books, but they're difficult books to read and to face up to. The book by Sven Beckert is a history of the production of cotton. It's not limited to the Old South. It's a worldwide history. But what he says about the Old South is that the textile mills in Manchester and Liverpool kept demanding more and more cotton, which required the plantation production of the Old South to require the slave community to produce more and more and more cotton. And the conclusion of the book is that wherever you find the production of cotton worldwide, you will find violence. The second title, you can see by the title, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, is a study of how powerful people have deliberately kept vulnerable people in debt as a way of maintaining a cheap supply of labor. And Graeber is not a theologian or a Bible scholar, but he ends his book about the crisis of debt by saying that the only way forward in an economy of debt is a jubilee year in which debt somehow is forgiven. The third title, you may recognize the name of James Risen. He is a journalist who has been in court several times because he would not reveal his sources. And this is a book that considers how the dominant power makers in our society are committed to endless war in the interest of greed. What interested me most about this book is that he says that the interests of greed and perpetual war have figured out that fear is a terrific tool for continuing to raise money to pay for perpetual war. So every time a budget must be passed for the military, the fear factor revs up, and we all run to the barricades. The fourth book, with the title Expulsion, is a study that is loaded with statistics that shows that the extraction economy is systematically expelling worldwide, is systematically expelling vulnerable people from their land, from their water, and from their mineral rights, producing refugees and homeless people and hapless people. And in an almost throwaway paragraph, the author says that expulsion in the United States takes the form of mass incarceration, whereby vulnerable people lose their property and their home base by being imprisoned. And the fifth book was the most stunning to me. I think it's probably the easiest to read. In alternating chapters, this author lines out justice for poor people and justice for wealthy people in the U.S. system. And what he says about justice for poor people is that there are endless police sweeps in which poor people are arrested for standing in front of their apartment because they're blocking traffic, or they are arrested for standing on the grass when they should have been standing on the sidewalk. And the police sweep picks up people like that, and there is normally no case against them, so they are sent home having lost a day of work with a record of having been arrested. The alternate chapters about justice for the wealthy is simply a review of the fact that given the plundering of our economy that led to the 2008 recession, that no financial person that produced that crisis has ever been indicted for anything. And this author concludes that the reason for that is that Eric Holder, the Attorney General, has long since been in the pocket of Wall Street. Now, these books may not interest you and they may not suit you, but I have concluded that they are a fair critical representation of the context within which the church has to read the Bible and try to practice the economic ethic that is commended in the texts of the gospel. I have no doubt that what we call the free market system in the United States is essentially a predatory system that is very nearly unregulated. And it puts communities at risk, and it makes the maintenance of our infrastructure almost impossible. So you may not agree with that, but entertain it for a moment, because now I'm going to do what you probably would prefer I do. I'm going to talk about biblical texts. And I'm going to talk about 4 case studies of an economy of extraction in the Bible, and I'm going to consider the ways in which the Bible responds to those crises of extraction. The first case of extraction, which is certainly paradigmatic for biblical faith, is that of Pharaoh in the Old Testament. And it may be that Pharaoh was an historical figure, but he is certainly a paradigm. And while we have used a great deal of energy trying to identify which Pharaoh was the Pharaoh of the Bible, it's very interesting that the Bible never tells us the name of Pharaoh. And I think the reason for that is that if you've seen one Pharaoh, you've seen all Pharaohs, because all Pharaohs act alike. You may recall that we first meet Pharaoh in Genesis. In chapter 12, Abraham and Sarah go down to Egypt in the famine because Pharaoh has got lots of food. In fact, Pharaoh's got everything. It is highly ironic that in chapter 41 of Genesis, Pharaoh has 2 nightmares about scarcity. Now, I want you to notice the irony. The guy with the most has the nightmare about running out. And his intelligence community cannot decipher the nightmares, so he had to find a Jew, Joseph. Jews have been dream interpreters long before Freud, because Jews have to live in this shadow land between public reality and hidden reality. And Joseph tells Pharaoh that you've had nightmares about scarcity, and Pharaoh asks Joseph, what do you think I ought to do? And Joseph says, I think you ought to appoint a food czar. And Joseph is the only candidate. In Genesis 47, that we will never read in church, we get a glimpse of Pharaoh's policy in which when the famine came, he sold food to the subsistence farmers. When they came the second year for food, it never occurred to him to give them food. He took their cattle and put them out of production. And the third year when they came for food, he took their bodies and their land and made them slaves. And it's an extraordinary chapter, because by the end of the paragraph, these now become slaves. That's how most people in the world have become slaves, was through debt. They say, thank you so much for saving our lives and taking our land and making us slaves. So that you can see the process of Pharaoh's predatory policy of anxiety, scarcity, accumulation, monopoly. And then when you turn the page to the first chapter of the book of Exodus, you get scarcity, anxiety, accumulation, monopoly, violence. This process will always end in violence toward the vulnerable poor that end up in debt. Now, I won't take your time to say that the Exodus event is the gospel response to that extraction system. And you know how that works. After the Israelite slaves cry out in their anguish about slavery, God hears. And in the burning bush, God resolves to emancipate them. And then after God boasts a while, saying, I have heard, I have seen, I know, I will come down, I will deliver you, I will take you into a land of milk and honey. Then God says to Moses, you go to Pharaoh. Not me, you. And the rest is history. So the most paradigmatic narrative in the Bible is about God's power at work in emancipation from an extraction system. And you know how that story goes. They left Egypt. They wanted out of the reach of Pharaoh's system. And in Exodus 16, they take 2 verses into the wilderness. The wilderness means being out of reach of Pharaoh. And after 2 verses, they want to go back. Because Pharaoh had such a grip on their imagination, they could not imagine life apart from Pharaoh. But what they discovered is that the wilderness that had no visible life supports has ample bread, ample water from rocks, and ample meat from quail. What they discovered is that the world beyond the predatory reach of Pharaoh is a place of God's abundance, so much abundance that on the 7th day you don't have to hustle for bread, you can rest. There was and is no Sabbath rest in Pharaoh's system. And the only thing I'm going to say about Mount Sinai and the 10 Commandments is that you read the 10 Commandments differently if you entertain the thought that the commandments are rules for maintaining life outside the reach of Pharaoh. So as you know, or you should know, the 10 Commandments begin, I am the Lord thy God who emancipated you from Pharaoh. And the 10 Commandments end, you shall not be acquisitive the way Pharaoh is acquisitive. Acquisitive has a very different sound from the word covet, doesn't it? Covet sounds like petty little envy. But acquisitiveness is about policy of seizing what belongs to other people. So the founding story of Israel in the Old Testament is the intervention of God that makes possible life outside the predatory system of Pharaoh. The second case that I'm going to talk about is the case of Solomon. You may know that Solomon is Pharaoh's son-in-law. He married the boss's daughter. And what we teach in Sunday school is that Solomon was really wise and that he built the temple. But we do not notice when we say that Pharaoh built the temple is that if you look in 1 Kings 5, 6, and 7, which are really dreary architectural plans for the temple, it's all about gold, 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 gold. Everything's gold. Could have been an Episcopalian. Because they told me in Atlanta at the cathedral that the cross you carry in is worth $10,000. I thought, who knew? So Solomon is a predator. He is a power in Jerusalem so that the money just came to him. I think there are probably 3 sources of Solomon's inordinate wealth. The first one is what interpreters call tribute money. That means protection money from more vulnerable states outside of Israel who depended on Solomon to keep that part of the world working. The second source of his inordinate revenue was forced labor. The texts are disputed. One text says that he only put foreigners to forced labor, and another text says he put everybody to forced labor. He had a supply of cheap labor, and very much wealth is dependent on cheap labor. So we're having a quarrelsome conversation about raising the minimum wage a little bit that is still not livable. And the third source of wealth is taxation. In 1 Kings 4, in a text you surely have never read, there is a long thing that describes all of the 12 tax districts geographically. For every tax district had to produce income for 1 month of the year. And it must have been very lucrative because 2 of those tax districts are headed by Solomon's sons-in-law. So it's a good thing to be in the tax business that taxed the peasants. And what you can notice in 1 Kings 12, when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam had to renegotiate the level of taxation, and the North refused his tax policies. They killed the revenue officer for Rehoboam, and Rehoboam had to get on his mule and flee for his life. Now, what I want you to observe, I'm just telling you what's in the text, how we have misread the Solomon text, simply missing the under-narrative of exploitation. The response, the gospel response to Solomon's system is the prophetic movement. Solomon's Jerusalem for the next 400 years became a taxing, tribute-collecting system of privilege and injustice. And the prophetic tradition is essentially a critique of the Jerusalem system. Some of the prophets were in the north, and it was the same thing in the capital city of Samaria. So that's not very different. And what the prophetic tradition continues to say in the 8th century and the 7th century is that this system of predatory economics is unsustainable and Jerusalem will be destroyed. The third case study that I will cite, which is less known among us, is the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire dominated the biblical world for 250 years, and it is the habit of biblical interpreters to say that the Babylonian Empire was really bad and the Persian Empire was kind of nice. Well, there are no nice empires because they exist to control the economy. And these texts may not be so familiar to you, but in Nehemiah 9, my Bible does not fall open to Nehemiah either, but you could take a peek. In Nehemiah 9, Ezra prays this long prayer. And long prayers usually have just a few themes. One theme is God is so good, and the other theme is we are so sinful. That all of this trouble with Persia has come upon us because of our sin. But the last 2 verses of Nehemiah 9 are among the most pathos-filled verses in the Bible, because Ezra says in his prayer to God, here we are, slaves in our own land, and the produce of our land that God wanted us to have, because it is the land of promise, is now in the hands of foreign kings, Persians, who can do whatever they want with our land and our livestock. And then the last phrase is, and we are in great distress. One of the interesting things about those last verses is that there's not even a petition. There's not even asking God to do anything. I think Ezra couldn't think what to ask. I think the situation was so desperate he didn't have the nerve to pray a prayer of petition. So it turns out that the Persian governance is not much better than Babylon or Assyria. They're all predators. And the response, one response is in Nehemiah 5, which, if you do not know it, is one of the great texts of the Old Testament. It says that poor Jews were having to sell their children in order to pay their mortgage, and were having to not eat food in order to pay their taxes to Persia. Now, what you need to know about the tax system is that the way empires work, including the U.S. empire, you don't send direct agents, you find a local who will cooperate with you. So what the Persians did was to find Jewish tax collectors who would tax other Jews. And the way it worked, it was a good deal if you were a tax collector, because you had to send so much money to Persia, but if you could collect more than that, you could keep it for yourself. So the Jewish tax collectors on behalf of Persia were taxing other Jews so that they were losing their land and their children. And Nehemiah is the Jewish governor. He's on the Persian payroll. He's the Jew who's the governor of Jews. And Nehemiah says, when I heard that, I was very angry. And then one translation says, and Nehemiah, which is a really good administrative strategy, Nehemiah took counsel with himself. That's the best counsel. And Nehemiah said to these Jewish tax collectors, stop it! Stop taxing other Jews. Remember, you're a Jew and they're a Jew and we're all Jews together. And then he said, I want you to return all that money to them with interest. And the wondrous thing that happened is that the Jews made a covenant, and the rich, predatory Jews and the poor, vulnerable Jews decided to live in solidarity together outside the pressure of Persia. These are amazing stories. The fourth case study that I want to talk about is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire worked just like the Persian Empire, just like the Babylonian Empire, just like the Assyrian Empire. Empires find locals to collect tax money to send to Rome. It was a very exploitative system. Did you ever wonder why Jesus spent time with tax collectors? It is because they were Jews serving Rome who forgot that they were Jews. So in Luke 19, Jesus comes where Zacchaeus the tax collector is. And you remember that Zacchaeus climbed a tree to see Jesus. Fred Craddock says that's because Jesus was short. Maybe Zacchaeus was short. It's the big short. And Jesus says to Zacchaeus in the tree, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm a tax collector." He said, "Why don't you come on down?" And Zacchaeus says, "If, just in case I've cheated anybody, just in case, I will repay them fourfold," which is according to the Jewish Torah, fourfold. And Jesus says, "Why don't you come on down and I will eat at your house and salvation will come to your house today," which is simply the presence of Jesus. And then he says to Zacchaeus, "Do you know who you are?" And Zacchaeus kind of hangs his head and avoids eye contact. He says, "Yes, I'm a Jewish tax collector for Rome." And Jesus said, No, that's not who you are. You've forgotten who you are. And then the text says that Jesus said to him, "I will tell you who you are. You are a son of Abraham." What a moment. You forget who you are, and you collude with the empire of predation. So I imagine in that moment, Zacchaeus stood up straight in a way he had not for a very long time, because he remembered who he was as a son of the promise. So I propose that the Jesus movement that clustered around Jesus, that became the church, the Jesus movement is God's strategy for resisting the Roman Empire of extraction. And I propose that the Christian movement continues to be God's strategy for helping life be possible outside of the extraction system. You can see that most clearly in the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is most attentive of all of the Gospel versions to questions of economics. It begins already in Mary's Magnificat in Luke 1. You remember where it says he will fill the hungry with good things and send the rich empty away. I have noticed that what we do is we use that text, but we set it to such nice music that nobody notices what's being said. And in Luke 12, in response to a question about a family dispute about land, the one son comes and said, "Divide the estate with my brother." Jesus tells a parable about a rich farmer who had a lot but thought he didn't have enough yet, and he tore down his barns to build bigger barns. And you remember the parable, he died in the night, and the voice says, "All this stuff you gathered, who's going to get that now?" Which is the question that's always asked of the extraction system. And then Jesus, good teacher that he was, he treats that parable as what we call in the seminary a critical incident. And then you always ask the seminarians, "What do you think was going on here?" And the disciples are just like seminarians, they avoid eye contact like that. "Don't call on me." And Jesus says, "Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious, because I am inviting you to live outside of the extraction system." It is the extraction system that produces anxiety. It is the extraction system that keeps us too busy and too rushed. It is the extraction system that requires too many soccer practices and too many ballet lessons, etc., etc. My son has 3 little kids, and I sat one night with John and his wife for an hour while they worked out their schedule for the next week about, you got to pick up Amelia at 3 o'clock on Monday and get her over there, and Annabelle will be waiting because she will have a tennis lesson for. And you know, if you have adult children, you have an imprint from biting your lip. Because I wanted to say, are you crazy? Are you crazy people? Jesus said, live like a bird. Live like a flower. And then he said, yet I tell you that not even, what's the word? Not even Solomon. You think that's accidental? Or do you think Jesus knew I was going to cite Solomon tonight? Not even Solomon, the great predator, was well off as a bird. And then Jesus says, get to work on justice, and your heavenly Father will make sure you got everything you need. Extraordinary. It's just a story. Luke 14, he tells the story of the banquet, and the moneyed people were too busy to come. They had 3 events that night. He said, well, the banquet is really for street people. Tell them all to come in because there's plenty for all of us. And in chapter 16, he tells this parable of the rich man and Lazarus. And the rich man won't give Lazarus anything. My friend Andy, who is the most conservative person I know, I have lunch with him once a week, and he never fails to tell me he can't stand it that poor people get a free lunch. Lazarus should not get a free lunch. He should at least pay something, Andy says. And then you know what happens? Lazarus goes to the bosom of Father Abraham. Father Abraham is the father of unconditional love. And the rich man in torment, Luke says to the judge, would you please send some messengers to warn my brothers so they're not as stupid as I am? And the judge says, nope, they got Moses, and that's all they're going to get. They got the commandments. Obey them. So Jesus is such a good reader of the Old Testament. He gives Abraham to the poor man, and he assigns the rich man to Moses. We generally do the opposite. We generally imagine in our well-offness that we are children of unconditional love, and poor people ought to get their ass in gear. But Jesus does that the other way. So I was looking around, and I thought, well, maybe Luke. But then I looked at the epistles, in which I have no expertise, and I noticed that in Ephesians and Colossians, which are 2 epistles not written by Paul, but written by someone else with the same name, that they got catalogs of things that baptized people should not do. They are called the works of the flesh. And in Ephesians 5, the list includes greed, and then a parenthetical comment, which is idolatry. Greed is the worship of a false god. And the same in Colossians, which is probably a baptismal formula that if you're going to be baptized, you got to give all these things up. And one of them is greed. which is idolatry. And I noticed in Galatians that Paul writes that there's only one commandment, and that is love your neighbor. And in the next verse he says, take heed lest you do not bite each other so that you will devour each other. And what you might want to know is that the word bite in Hebrew is the same word for collecting interest. Paul probably knew that. So twice, once in Matthew and once in Luke, God says you cannot worship God and wealth. We translated mammon so nobody knows what we're talking about. And I think, I don't know any of you, but I think probably all of us in the ownership class, we're all busy trying to serve God and serve mammon. We're trying to do both. And the reason I wanted to say these things to you is that I think we are now in an economic context where baptized people probably have to make some decisions about these matters. The matters are not personal, the matters are systemic. So I have 5 conclusions that have come to me. The first one is that we live in a society where extraction has now become normal. We don't even notice it. We just accept it as the given about how society works. And what extraction does is to stratify people according to their worth and to stratify people according to the goods for life to which they have access. I'm aware of that every time I fly Delta. Well, first of all, you should say that a commercial airplane is arranged just like Solomon's temple, which is stratified. There is the outer court, and then there's the middle court, and then there is the Holy of Holies, where only the priests may go. I'm not making this up. And then I noticed that my boarding pass says Group 1. So when they call a flight, I'm there. I'm ready. And then what I discover is there are 3 groups before Group 1. I am, in fact, in Group 4, but they don't want me to notice. But I notice. Second conclusion is that this is a desperate time for serious thinking about an alternative to a system of extraction. And I dare say that the church and the synagogue are the only communities that have a script that will fund an alternative vision of the economy, and that depends on us reading it well. So imagine that the church, the national denomination, the judicatories, the congregations, have this as a primary conversation about what are we being told in the gospel. That'll be a very hard conversation among us. I think it is the conversation for which we are now responsible. The third conclusion is that having that conversation and reading this text well will put almost all of us in profound tension. Like, I don't want to know that. And I propose that it is not the work of the church to alleviate that tension. It is the work of the church to help us live honestly in that tension and perhaps to make new decisions according to our baptism. The fourth conclusion that I draw is that in the meantime, we need to be thinking more generously about how to make provision for the non-producers. Because the extraction system is very impatient with the non-producers. They are dispensable people, best imprisoned and certainly best kept out of view in our cities. Now, one of the interesting checks on that is to discover, I think this is right, see if you agree, that the really big managers of the predatory system are also non-producers. They don't produce anything. We used to have those ads, we make money the old-fashioned way, we work for it. But the people to whom that ad was aimed never worked for it. So it may be helpful to us to recognize that we may have non-producers at both ends of the economy of extraction. Final conclusion is that if this is a responsibility of the church to read the text well, it is really important to recognize that the church is the only community that has a regularly performed symbolic act, sacrament, that is called thanks. Because, Eucharist is simply the Greek word for thanks. Imagine, every time we meet, we gather around thanks. Do I have to tell you that the extraction system never expects anybody to express thanks for anything? Because it is achievement, possession. It is not regarded as gift. And what we perform every time we gather around this table is that it's all gift. And gifts are not owned, they are received and shared. So I think we have not done a very good job around the table to help people recognize that this extraordinary act of gratitude is a huge gesture against extraction, and it relates to abundance in public places. So I said to my associate rector, you ought to use big pieces of bread, signifying abundance instead of cardboard. And she said, it's just too inconvenient. So how can abundance be inconvenient? Abundance is the sacramental recognition that in God's world there is enough for all to live well when it is shared.
Dr. Brueggemann has graciously agreed to take a few questions from the audience before we finish our evening. There's a microphone in the center aisle, and I would invite anyone who'd like to pose a question to proceed that way, and we'll just sort of rotate through the line as we go. I might pose the first, and please, anyone, feel free to move in that direction. Dr. Brueggemann, you mentioned early on the concept of Sabbath, which we've studied in your work at this church, and its contrast with Egypt. And then it sort of came back, I thought, with the example you gave of your children and grandchildren as they were managing their life so carefully. And I'm wondering if you could explore a little bit about what you see as the importance of Sabbath in the modern world, and perhaps what some of the challenges are of us not having taken it.
Well, you may know that the subtitle of that book is Saying No to a Culture of Consumerism. I think that Sabbath is an act of resistance against the commodity system of extraction because it makes clear that my life is not defined by doing more and getting more and being more, but that I already have enough and have done enough and am enough. I talked to a woman last week in Denver, and she said she and her husband have decided to keep Sabbath from Friday dusk to Saturday dusk. And when she told her friends, the response was anger. Was anger because we don't want anybody disengaging from the commodity system. That's astonishing to me. And I'm as big a workaholic as anybody I know. You ask, what's the result of that? I think that no Sabbath means we stay exhausted. And when we stay exhausted, we do not have the leisure time to think critically. And when a society no longer thinks critically, I think we are on our way to fascism. And I think there is ample evidence of that among us today. So we have to think about that. How do we create space in our life for reflective presence? I think it's very difficult for us.
Thank you. Yes, first question, please. Just speak loudly into the microphone, if you would.
It's been my experience that we tend to demonize people who are different from us, other parts of the world, and so forth. And I was a little saddened to hear the Persians come off not too well, because we have so much demonizing with people from Iraq and Iran and so forth, especially Iran right now. And it's been my experience when you have intercourse with people, you talk, you tend not to want to bomb them. And I've had some positive experience with people from Iran. And I'd like for you to comment about the relationship between ancient Persia and today's Iran. Just the historical, of course, at the end of World War I, it was all split up arbitrarily. But I'd like to hear your read on Persia.
I expect that you know more about that than I do. If you know anything about it, you know more than I do. I think the Shah, at his lavish birthday party, sort of tried to situate himself in that. I think we don't recognize that Persia is a very ancient culture of which Iranians are very proud. And I think we prefer to demonize and to think they're all nuts. And it is a compromised democracy, but then we live in a compromised democracy. And I think we would do well to honor that long tradition. You know, when you think about that kind of culture, it's like ours started yesterday compared to that. Ours is a great inheritance, but it's a short one compared to that. Thank you for that.
Please just speak loudly into the microphone.
Dr. Brueggemann, it strikes me that our culture is one of great individualism, particularly since 9/11 with fear-mongering. How do we as an American church, and how do we practice the nonviolence of which Jesus speaks to? Because every time that's moved in that direction, there's a more violent response to nonviolence, and moving away from individualism to community than there is if we try to just act within the system that there is here.
Yep. Well, I don't have any notion about how we do that. I think that on the one hand, individualism is pernicious among us, but because it causes the disappearance of the common good. On the other hand, I think it's an illusion. And I think of that car ad that begins with a cookie cutter. Well, I don't know what car that is. It says, you don't want cookie cutter cars because they're all alike. Buy ours, which is a cookie cutter car. which I think is that the ad wants to make the point that you are really a special individual if you buy our car. But it's an illusion. And I think we ought to certainly teach our children that kind of phony individualism that is everywhere in our culture is a recipe for unhealth, when in fact we all depend upon communities that give us gifts. Even Donald Trump was given his first $1 million by his father. He said today, it was just a little bit I got from my dad. Well, thank you so much. And if we can practice the awareness that we all are recipients of gifts, it may create a kind of possibility for generosity among us that we will not practice if we imagine that we are all self-made and we don't owe anybody anything. And you can see that television, which is the liturgy of the extraction system, it keeps pumping out phony individualism, but it does so in the service of conformity. Because I think the worst ads are for directed TV, because you don't want to be a settler. If you're a settler, you're dumb, and you're going to be left behind. And you don't want to be left behind in the extraction system. That's what I think. Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful talk this evening. I just finished reading Beckert's book, Empire of Cotton, and was just blown away by the story of violence and coercion that lie at the heart of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. And in the New Testament, the apostles have a communitarian way of life, and we have a political election cycle where we had the extremes of communitarianism, socialism, and capitalism being put forth. How do you see on that spectrum between those two extremes where the Christian church would lead us in light of I think, the unknown story, which we're taught not to really learn this story of violence in our economic system.
Right.
So how do we become educated, and where does that education via the church lead us in terms of how we practice our economic life?
Right. I think, for the most part, it is unhelpful for the church to get involved in theoretical discussions about socialism and capitalism. I think it's a no-go. I think that the real issue in the church is the neighbor, 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 neighbor. And the question that Jesus kept posing is, who is my neighbor? And obviously what Jesus intended is that the zone of neighborliness needs to keep expanding until we discover that all of the brothers and sisters and rabbits and carrots are all our neighbors. But we have very truncated notions of neighbors. I read and was talking to someone about a crash of an airliner somewhere in Asia, and the person said, well, thank God there were no Americans on it. Guess that takes care of that. None of us. And I think we do a good job in the church with 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds about loving neighbor. But we don't carry that into adulthood so that we think about public policy in terms of neighborly action. And I think that we ought to talk about particular issues and not theoretical economic systems. Because as Bernie Sanders is discovering, the word socialism can mean anything. It basically turns out to mean, I like my entitlements from the government, but I don't want you to have any. That's a sort of socialism. Yeah. Thank you for integrating this process.
Hi, thank you. You're the greatest. I've got a question for you. When you were talking about Zacchaeus and
about what?
Zacchaeus and Jesus, I was thinking that I meet a lot of tax collectors in the sense of I meet a lot of oppressed people who are just under that level of the empire's oppression, who continue that into that, like buying into that system, and get angry at those who are poorer than they are, and continue buying into this. Though they don't realize that they are the tax collector, right? They don't. They continue in this sense of oppression by what I feel is like colluding with the empire. How do you remind them that they are sons of Abraham? Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Okay.
I do indeed. I think that we have to, if we're going to do this, and we haven't voted on that, but if we're going to do this, we have to give people categories of interpretation that for the most part they do not have. And if we can help people understand the extraction process, we will soon discover that people like us are all participants So liberals and conservatives are in this together. Al Sharpton said about the movie industry that it's like a mountain. The higher you go, the wider it gets. So the higher you go, the more we are enmeshed in the system. But for the most part, all of our kind of people are involved in that system. So it's not a matter of pointing fingers. It's not a matter of indicting someone else. We just have to think through together about how it is that this system recruits and persuades us all and talks us out of our baptism. And I think that for the most part, Christians who are enmeshed in the extraction system have largely been talked out of our baptism. We have forgotten our gospel identity. So it's not a matter of pointing fingers. It's a matter of having a different kind of conversation in which we can think through together, how does our money work? And to whom do we trust our money? And what leverage does money have as it affects our lives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? You can think of questions to ask. And raising those questions will evoke a good bit of resistance, like why doesn't the church stay with religion? And then the answer is because the Bible will not let us, and so on and so on. But over time, these categories become available to people, and perchance we may think differently. So my church, we take our turn, and we set up little booths in our parking lot, and we hand out food to our neighbors who have no food. And last time I was there, I noticed we who are handing out food all have name tags. They don't. And nobody at St. Timothy's has yet raised the question, how come these people don't have food? Well, it's because they're lazy. I think they probably should get a job and work for $7 an hour. It would be respectable, you know. So we have to learn to raise the questions that arise in the text. How come Lazarus doesn't have any bread? Because the rich man was collecting it. Because the rich man thought he didn't have enough yet. And if you start thinking that way, you don't ever have enough yet. So maybe the question is, have you got enough yet? If you got enough now, what do you think you ought to do with more? Are you worried that your children are growing up and not have enough? Are you worried about any other children in the city who are going to grow up and not have enough? Since in Cincinnati, 53% of our children live below the poverty line. Are you worried about that? You know, that's how my mind works. None of that's easy. But if we read the Bible well, these questions become unavoidable. Now, I go to an Episcopal church, so I have to warn you that the lectionary leaves out most of the good texts. So you got to cheat a little. I didn't persuade our rector, but Advent a year ago, he used 4 lament psalms at Advent instead of the designated psalms. Laments are raising the cries of the world. And I said to him, I didn't think you could do that. He said, well, you can either ask the bishop's permission or you can hope the bishop doesn't find out. Either way.
In the interest of our time, we'll take these two questions and then continue the conversation in the next room.
With our system, the system of extraction more entwined with our authorities, the authorities that have been put over us, how do we defy that system and, in essence, those authorities while still respecting what Paul says about not rebelling against the authorities in Romans?
Sandy and I were talking about Bonhoeffer's discovery that you can't take that too literally about respecting authorities. It will require mass movement. It requires people who live in comfortable suburbia because of their baptism signing on with community organizing practices. It has to do with mobilizing our bodies together in front of authority. That's not violent, but it is the exercise of citizenship. It is the matter of calling authorities to account when power is organized against a healthy vision of society. Now, I want to tell you about living in suburbia and being involved. I do not mind dying for Christ. I'm ready to do that. But I do not want to be inconvenienced. And this is very inconvenient. But if we are not propelled by the extraction system, we will have extra time and extra energy to redeploy our lives.
Thank you, Dr. Brueggemann. I've actually been sitting here praying, struggling with how to ask my question because, on the one hand, my heart does break so intensely for the marginalized in our society and those whose homes are taken out from under their feet. But my heart also breaks after my own sin. As a sinner, I stand before a holy God. And my concern is that, on one hand, it sounds great and a beautiful thing to minister to those who are suffering from this economy of extraction. But I'm not sure. There's a part of me that thinks it's going to take more than even that our hearts have to break over the God who was broken for our sins. He in Isaiah 53, he says he makes he bore the sin for many, and he makes intercession for our transgressions. And I think the rich and the poor alike have to come together and allow our hearts to break after Christ's, death and resurrection and his intercession, everything that he pours out for us. I hear Paul say that no one is righteous, not even one, echoing a Psalm of David. And I'm not sure that we can just do it on our own.
So, see if I heard you rightly, that you are concerned about the personal matter of sin, and you are setting that over against public questions of justice. Is that right?
Yes. I wouldn't be asking this question if it were just about economic extraction, but we're talking about reading the Bible faithfully.
I understand that. And what I want to say to you is that it's not an either or. It's a both and. So the good news of the gospel is that you, in your sin, and me in my sin, we have been forgiven. He bore the transgressions of us all. The question is, what shall we do with our forgiven life? And the answer is, go. Go to the neighbor. I don't want to dismiss the whole agenda of atonement. That's what you're talking about, right? That's good.
Yeah.
But the long history of the church has been so preoccupied with that agenda that we have failed to notice what the Jesus movement is about. Jesus did not get crucified for having sins forgiven. He got crucified for being a threat to the extraction system. He is an enemy of the state. And we have to struggle with that. But I would settle for saying it's a both and. Okay. So we are. If I understand the Christian gospel and the liturgy, we are not burdened with continuing to walk under our sin. We are forgiven. Now, we do the liturgy, so we reiterate that forgiveness. But being forgiven is not the end of the drama. Being forgiven in order that we may love and serve you with gladness and singleness of heart. And what I've been talking about tonight is serving God with gladness and singleness of heart. That make sense?
Yes, but if I may, I'm sorry, I don't mean to hold everyone up.
Go ahead.
You say that we, the church, have the only script for curing this economic system of extraction, and if it comes down to just, kind of recognizing. I guess I'm wondering how what is the ultimate script? Because for me, again, it is that Christ is pouring out His Spirit.
Pouring out His Spirit to what end? If you read the book of Acts, where yes, God's Spirit is poured out, what the apostles are endlessly doing is confronting the authorities of Rome. They are in court all the time, witnessing to the new life given in Christ, to the empire. If you read the book of Acts, the magistrates and the governors just keep coming up in the narrative, and they are bamboozled by the church under the Spirit. They really are. So I think the question that you and I have to struggle with is, given the fact that Christ died for our sins, given the fact that we are forgiven, how do we live differently now? And the church has too long taught us that the way we live differently now is to practice proper sex and don't cut through the neighbor's lawn and all that kind of stuff. But if you read what Jesus is up to, the new life to which He calls people is a very public life. And I think that there are certain strands of Christianity that have simply stopped with the atonement. It's no place to stop, because the purpose of forgiveness is that we may re-engage the world in better ways.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Brueggemann, for those inspiring words. As we conclude this evening, I'd like to express my thanks to the Speakers Series Committee at the Church of the Holy Communion and to the parish staff, especially to my Associate Rector, the Reverend Ben Badgett, who have worked tirelessly to make this evening the success that it was. Dr. Brueggemann has graciously agreed to make an appearance tomorrow morning at a breakfast for Memphis area clergy, organized by an interdenominational and interracial host committee. There's still room at this roundtable discussion for any minister who'd like to participate, and sign-ups are available at the hospitality table in the parish hall. Church of the Holy Communion invites everyone to a reception and book signing with Dr. Brueggemann in Cheney Parish Hall, which you'll find just through these doors to the south. We also invite you to join us for worship on Sundays and for fellowship and activities on Wednesday evenings. Once again, thank you so very much for coming. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all this night and forevermore. Amen.